The Victorian era was a time of staunch morals and strict standards for the people in Britain. Both men and women had a certain way that they must act and feel. These stereotypes were harsh and almost impossible to fit perfectly into. Many authors during the Victorian age, and for some after that, struggled to find balance in appropriate writing, but also rejecting those standards in favor for more interesting characters. One of the most unattainable stereotypes in Victorian Britain was that of the angel in the house. Writers, both male and female alike, have been struggling to kill the idea of the angel in the house, rejecting the one-dimensional trope in favor for imperfect female characters who don't embody one stereotype and one stereotype only. Charles Dickens and Virginia Woolf are at the forefront of this movement, using their writing to call out those who would place women in one box and attempt to keep them there. Charles Dickens is widely regarded as one of the best novelists in the Victorian era. Throughout his works, he was intensely critical of the staunch morals that the Victorians attempted to embody. His own life reflected a rejection of those values, most especially with what is known as the angel in the house trope. This trope was made popular by the poet Coventry Patmore, who wrote the poem for his wife, who he believed was the ideal Victorian woman. While she too gentle, even to force, his penitence by kind replies, waits by, expecting his remorse. With pardon in her pitying eyes, and if he once, by shame oppressed, a comfortable word confers, she leans and weeps against his breast, and seems to think the sin was hers. Were an eye to see her charms, at any time she is still his wife, dearly devoted to his charms. At any time she is still his wife. She loves with love that cannot tire. Basically, what this meant was that the wives are to be ever loving towards their husbands, no matter the sins that he commits. They must bring their husbands' sins into their own bodies in order to redeem their husbands in the eyes of God. This trope would eventually dominate Victorian society, and if you were a woman and did not embody this, then you were in the wrong. Catherine Thompson Hogarth was Charles Dickens's wife. On the surface, she was what seemed to be like the perfect Victorian woman. She gave birth to many children, and she was the angel in the house, the ideal woman during that time. But Dickens found his wife to be rather boring and childish, not to mention an inept mother and homemaker. Additionally, the presence of the vivacious Ellen Tiernan provided a stark and unfortunate contrast between the two women. Victorian conventions had men shaming their own physical desires and hiding them, while touting from the rooftops the virtues of a chaste woman. Dickens himself had a different solution to this problem. He found balance between his wife and her younger sister, Mary Hogarth. Catherine filled his physical desires, whilst Mary was the epitome of innocence. Upon her young death, the balance was thrown off in his house. This is where he marked the beginning of the end of his marriage. Subsequently, when Catherine's other sister, Georgina, joined the household to make up for her sister's ineptness in the homemaking, this somewhat restored the balance. His rejection of Victorian stereotypes shows up in many of his novels. In Hard Times, none of the women epitomize the idea of what the angel in the house is supposed to be. Louisa Gradgrind is a submissive daughter, which gives her one of the characteristics, but she's also extremely unhappy in her marriage and even contemplates having an affair with another man. By Victorian standards, this makes Louisa a part of the fallen woman trope. But Dickens does not characterize her in this way. He treats her in an almost sympathetic manner, and in the end, she's finally gaining the thing she needs the most: human emotion. Here was Louisa on the night of the same day, watching the fire as in days of yore, though with a gentler and humbler face. Hard Times, page 246. Dickens also is often critiqued for his brusque treatment of women in his novels. For example, in Oliver Twist, there's a character named Nancy who is sympathetic towards young Oliver, and in the end, her good deed is what gets her beaten to death by her lover Sikes. The fallen woman trope by Victorian standards would have applied to Nancy, who is an implied prostitute. But her treatment of Oliver is her saving grace and redeems her in the reader's eyes. Her brutal murder can most easily be attributed to Dickens' obsession with death and murder. Nancy is a prostitute, but instead of being murdered because of her profession, she is murdered because of her maternal feelings towards Oliver. Despite his issues with women in his life and in his writings, Dickens helped to nurture the idea that women are multifaceted and that they will never fit snugly into one stereotype and should be treated as such. Virginia Woolf was a prolific writer who was born at the tail end of the Victorian era, a time when society was extremely straight-laced and moralistic. She was a child in a blended family of 8 children, 4 from her father's and mother's other marriages. Woolf struggled throughout her life with mental illness, and a lot of it could be attributed to 2 events: being sexually abused by her older half-brother, Gerald Duckworth, or the subsequent death of her mother, Julia Stephen, when she was only 13 years old. She carried a lot of her mental illness internally, having several mental breakdowns and bouts of depression in her formative years, and it eventually led to her suicide in 1941. Woolf called out the angel in the house trope by name, writing about it in her speech, Professions for Women, in 1931. She spoke about how it was her duty and the duty of all women writers to kill the angel in the house. When Woolf first began to write reviews for male authors, she explained that her first instinct was, be sympathetic, be tender, flatter, deceive, use all arts and wiles of our sex. Never let anybody guess that you have a mind of your own. Being the angel of the house would have taken all the wind out of Woolf's sails, and the heart out of her writing.